Well, thank you, Thelma. We appreciate the offer and the invitation to come and tell the Thomas story. Um, Jared called me with this while we were at Colorado, and I guess I'd had a premonition because June of 2023, I was feeling a little melancholy apparently, and I sat down and started writing Dad and Mom's story. I don't even know how many pages there are in this little book that I've handwritten, and it's unedited, so I'm fitting in Meriwether Lewis's um, um mold of not hiring an editor to clean up my penmanship, my grammar, and my spelling. According to we apparently had those three things in common. So we're going to tell our story. We're going to kind of tag team this. We really haven't even talked that much about what to do, but I do have a story that I've written about, and actually it's written from or to the grandkids, because our grandkids have no idea what the turn of the century, and not this century, but the past century, people went through. And so this story tells it from that standpoint of what a little bit of what they went through, and we couldn't be in a really better place to tell that story. You'll hear that in a moment. So I'm actually going to. There we go. I'm actually going to read parts of this. It could be very lengthy, and I apologize for the segregated grammar that you're going to hear. I'm going to start. This is My Dad and Me is what I titled it, and I wanted to tell this story from of my dad's story, which includes my mother and my brother and our family. W.C. Willis Thomas was born in January 3rd of 1925 to Willis and Maybelle Thomas. My granddad, Pawpaw Thomas, as we called him, was a product of hard times. He would have been born in the late 1800s. There were no cars, no planes, and no phones. It would have been difficult for them to communicate with their neighbors. So if they wanted to talk to a neighbor, they had to walk a couple of miles to the farm next door or to the house, or to either ride a horse or a carriage or something, but you couldn't talk to them otherwise. Life was very simple, but it was hard. My papa was called a sharecropper. He didn't own the land that he farmed. He only worked that farm and took a share of the profits. So when the crops failed, there was no income, and they didn't have any money to live on. So Mama Thomas, she contributed to the farm or the family by sewing. She was a seamstress here in Lindsay for many years. She made dresses and other clothing for extra income. She sold eggs, chickens for income. She had to protect her source of income from predators like chicken hawks. So I still have a 12-gauge shotgun that she used to kill chicken hawks with on the farm. Dad gave that to me many, many years ago. I tell this because we have no idea how hard times were. No electricity and no phones. Now, Dad, he was the third of four children. Gladys Douglas, whom I am named after. My middle name is Douglas. And Dad was the third, and the youngest was Thelma Thelma Wisenhunt. They owned a propane business here in Lindsay for many years. They all contributed to the working and living of the family and the household. Papa and the boys worked the farm while Mama and the two girls cooked, washed clothes, gathered eggs for sale, and I'm sure the girls were all taught how to sew. The boys, on the other hand, had a little more difficult time. From the time Dad was old enough to work, I'm guessing 11 or 12 years old, he drove a team of mules. Now driving doesn't, and again, remember I'm writing this to my grandkids, driving doesn't mean what you think. He would hitch two mules to leather straps that were attached to a large wooden cross. That cross would have been between two teams of horses, ran between the two mules toward the back or their tails. The plow would have been latched to the back of the rig. Dad would be dressed in overalls with no shirt on in the summer. He would toss the long reins over his shoulder that controlled the mules and drive the team. Again, that doesn't mean what you think. He would throw the reins over his shoulder and then walk through the field behind the plow and the plowed ground, and that would get the field ready for crops. Once, when I was a young fellow, I asked Dad why he had hair all over his right shoulder. He said that when he was young, he would drive the team of mules and put the reins over his left shoulder. That would keep the sun off of that shoulder. And the right shoulder was unprotected, and the right shoulder grew hair to protect it from the sun. So as a kid growing up, Dad had one hairy shoulder and one not hairy shoulder. Mom's laughing at that. The body was trying to to protect the skin from the hot sun. Dad also trapped coons and other mammals for the skins. He told me that he could get anywhere from 50 cents to $1 for skins. He would dry them in the sun, take them to town, and sell them. All the money went back to the family. It all contributed to the family. The kids got nothing for their work other than a food on the table. How's that sound? Well, occasionally I think they probably did get a piece of candy or soda at the when they'd go to town.
A stick of candy was a penny.
Yeah.
That long.
Yeah. So they did get some reward. As the family aged, the kids went to school. Mama made sure the kids had warm clothes for school. They walked to school if they didn't have a mule or a horse to ride, and it wasn't working on the farm. I think the Thomas kids probably walked to school most of the time. They were poor. Dad used to tell me he had to walk to school in 2 feet of snow, uphill both ways. Anybody ever heard that story? I used to laugh at that, but probably some of that was true. Maybe the uphill both ways wasn't true. I don't know. In time, all the kids were in the upper grades of school, not like school today. It was a one-room schoolhouse, like that right there. All the grades were in the same schoolroom. The teacher had to teach all classes to all the kids. The older kids would help with the younger ones. And I know that seems strange to you, but the kids out of this time got good educations. I think some would argue it was better than now. Just think about all of the founding fathers who started this great nation. They were all educated in the same way. They all were in the same room with little kids and big kids. But look what they accomplished. Great things came from small beginnings. As I said earlier, the family had no car, but when Douglas finished school, he got a job and purchased a car. He taught all the family how to drive, including Mama. But Papa was a different story. Once Douglas and Dad got Papa in the driver's seat of the car to teach him how to drive. Papa promptly drove the car down a hill and into a creek. He got out and never drove again. That was the last time that he ever drove the car. Many years later, after they left the farm and moved to town, Mama and Papa bought a 48 Chevrolet, a four-door car with 3-speed on the column. And Dad ended up with that car after they stopped driving. And that was the car that I learned to drive in out in Harrison Flats on the oil field lease roads. That's where I learned to drive. If you ran off the road, you was in trouble. Yes, it was wet. Back to Dad not finishing school. Can anyone guess why he didn't finish school? The war. He joined the Navy during World War II. Douglas had already been drafted, and he was in the Army and was in combat in Europe. So Dad got Mama to take him to town, or to the recruiter, to sign up for the Navy at 17 years old. He missed his senior year of school. He went to Dibble School, north of Lindsay. He rode a train after he got in. He rode a train out to California to the naval base for training. There, he was assigned to a ship out in Seattle, Washington. They left to cruise the area around Alaska at first. It was his first ship and his first assignment in the Navy. I've often wondered what would have made Dad go to the Navy. I'm sure that at 17 years old and in Lindsay, Oklahoma, he had probably never seen a boat, never seen a body of water larger than the Washita River at flood stage, and certainly had never seen an ocean. Why on earth would he have ever joined the Navy? I still don't know to this day. No one knows, and I don't know how much you know about World War II. Again, this is to the kids, but World War II was a worldwide war. We were fighting the Germans in Europe and in Africa, and the Japanese in the Pacific. Douglas was in Europe, and Dad was in the Pacific. They could write letters back and forth, but it would take weeks before they would get a return letter. Back home, electric lights had come, and not too long after, the phone.
Some of the V-mails come pretty quick.
V-mails would. That was like a telegraph, wasn't it? Essentially, like telegraph. Yeah. Mimeograph-like material. I'd forgot about that. Not like phones today. You could only have a phone or electricity if wires could get to your house. And that's where Rural Electric Co-op started, to provide electricity for our rural residents. And several of us in here live on Rural electricity. Dad told me while he was down in the South Pacific, he got a letter from Mama telling him, or maybe it was a email, telling him that he'd been drafted. So again, this is to the kids, the draft was a way for the military to get men to fight in the Army and the Navy. Dad wrote Mama back, if they want me, tell them to come and get me. I thought that was really funny when he told me that. I was probably in high school when he told me that story. At some point in the war, Dad and Douglas had arranged to come home on leave. When the time came, Dad got home when he was supposed to, but Douglas was delayed in Europe and didn't get to come. And they literally saw each other as the trains passed. Dad was going back and Douglas was coming in. And Douglas went back to Europe and was killed, and Dad never saw him again after that. I can't imagine what Dad's feelings were, and he wasn't alone. There were a lot of young men that felt the same way. They'd have siblings killed in the war, and they didn't get to grieve them or anything. They just had to do their jobs, grit their teeth, and there wasn't babying that during those times. You did your job or you were killed. So being a soldier, you had to be brave, and you had to do what you were supposed to do. Douglas ended up being wounded before he was killed. He and his ammunition bearer, and they carried Douglas carried Jim, his ammunition bearer, out to medics, and they were both shipped back to England, where Douglas was patched up, sent back to the war, and Jim was shot up so badly he went back to Washington, D.C., and he never returned to the war. One of the things that I guess I skipped it as I was trying to maneuver through these. I never really realized, oh, here it is. I hadn't got there yet. I didn't want to miss it because I thought it was pretty good. After the war, Dad didn't have much training for anything outside the farm. Some of the things that he did was he drove a wrecker. He was a firefighter and a carpenter. And at some point, he met a young lady by the name of Imogene Berkeley, and they fell in love and got married. I think it was pretty hasty.
6 months.
And they were married on October the 19th, 1946. And my birthday is October the 19th. They tell me it was 48, but I'm not 100% certain that that's right. There could be some. Oh, it's on the birth certificate. Okay. Well, you can bribe people to change those dates. After their marriage, Dad met a man by the name of Merle Hayden. Merle was an auto mechanic here in Lindsay, and Merle taught Dad how to do body work.
Well, you left out something.
Okay.
The Navy, well, the administration at that time, supplied the
Veterans,
I can't
returning soldiers.
Anyway, they would give $90 a month toward on training, and then the where they were employed would pay so much.
Oh, I see.
That's how he started body work.
I see. Okay. Okay. I didn't know that. It was a work program by the government.
He did on the ship.
Yeah, he was a crane operator on the ship. Anyway,
Sorry.
Merle took Dad under his wing and taught him how to do body work. That was fixing wrecked cars. He worked with Merle for several years until he could do it on his own. They worked for Clay Northcutt Chevrolet there on Main Street, which is now just a dilapidated building. But back in those days, it was a vibrant place on Main Street. I know y'all can't believe this, but when we were kids, all the parking places on Main Street were full. And all the stores were full.
And the streets were clean.
And the streets were
stores.
Yeah. It's really changed a lot.
3 car dealerships.
Yeah, we did. We had Buick, Ford, and Chevrolet. Yeah,
Buick Pontiac.
yeah, Buick, Pontiac, Paul Cameron's. That's where Ann's office is now. Ann, tell them about this is deviating a little bit, but tell them about the place on Main Street next to the printing press.
Oh,
Your building.
No.
not my building.
Oh,
Just not too long ago, after the web printing press burned,
Hmm.
then they cleared all that off, and part of the building they did not rebuild. And if you will walk down that sidewalk, you will see that there is tile that it was a drugstore there at some time. And if you look, you can definitely see it's that little white and black tile. You can see where the door was, you can see where the counters were, you can walk in, you can see where the pharmacy was. Never knew there was a pharmacy.
Yeah, it's right north of Daryl's building.
Yeah, right next to, and I've asked several people and they did not know that there was. So you may be the
Now, are
only.
you talking about the building right across the alley from Darrell?
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what. That used to be the post office.
Yes.
And when you were talking about selling
Yeah, I
houses,
remember
you know,
the
the
post office.
building is still there. And it's in that alley, that little tin building, it's grown up.
Yeah.
It's in the alley by Darrell's.
Behind Daryl.
Yeah.
That used to be Dad's,
that-
the back of Dad's body shop, that little tin building.
That, well, for the years, it was a cream station, hides,
Yeah, it
possums.
I'll be
stuff.
darned. I didn't know
And
that.
it's still standing. I took a
Yeah.
picture so my kids would have.
Yeah.
have that
Do
cost.
you know who had it?
We sold eggs, but let me back to the post office. That building was a post office. And it was ran by 3 men, Wayne McKenzie, oh shoot, Paula Barker's, daddy. What was his name?
Hilliard. Hilliard.
Yeah. And I can't think of the other person, but anyway,
Was it
what I'm fixing to say is they sure kept a clean post office. That post office was hexagon shaped, white, and ever so often would be a blue or a blackish,
Tiles
tile in, you know.
on the floor.
hexagon tile. That post office floor was the cleanest I ever saw all of the time.
So there was a post office, not a drugstore.
Well, it
Interesting.
might have been a grocery store.
Yeah, it
but not-
does.
Yeah, it
Oh, it
says
does.
drug
It says
on
drug
drug
on
on
it.
Yeah, in the top.
This
Yeah, I
is
was
before
I have
the
a
war
picture of
and
it if I
after.
can
Okay.
find it.
That I'm talking about.
That says
Interesting.
drug in there.
Yeah, but it definitely has drugs
Yeah.
in the black of the
Yeah,
tile.
black and then there was some blue every
Oh,
so often.
could be.
But all my lands.
I'd like to know the name of the
That was
drugstore,
so
'cause I
clean.
never knew there was a drugstore.
Me either, that was before my time.
Mother,
Yeah.
did you know there was not a grocery store, a drugstore? A drugstore there after the post office. Do you remember the drugstore?
After the,
Would
I
have
think
been
it would've
before or
been
after?
Not
before.
there,
I think
I
it would
know.
be before the,
Where Darrell is, it was P.R. Williamson's, years ago. I mean, when he
Really?
first came
It's
here.
up Tasco.
But no, I don't
well,
remember.
where
theirs.
was the theater open?
The drugstore that I remember a long time ago
theater
was
was
where
where-
the Beckman is. That was
Yeah.
the drugstore.
Right there on the
there
corner.
was 3 drugstores there
Yeah.
at one
hot
time.
place is.
That's what blew my mind when I
The
saw
theater
it.
was actually there where,
The old Eubanks.
no, the
Yeah.
old one that you're talking about
Right.
is there where the, Coffeyville.
Yeah.
Coffeyville.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
you're right.
That was a theater
That was
at
a
one
theater.
time?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was
And it was
next
a fancy
next to
name
the
of the
laundry.
Theater.
Rick Hood.
There was a blue
They had
movie
big
theater, wasn't there?
Yes,
We used
it
to-
was,
yeah, but they
where
did
the,
that.
fitness, the little fitness place, the,
Yeah.
Key Club,
Yeah.
Okay,
That's
that's
Blue
there?
Moon.
Oh, I was thinking it was J&L Insurance on that corner, but that's
No.
not right.
No, when
It
back when
wasn't
they
there.
tore that down, we are getting some of those bricks to sell on the Blue Moon Field.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Cool.
to make money for the Historical Society.
Cool.
But now, do you remember the name of the cream place,
Grandkids.
The
the
what?
name of the creamery?
Pullen ran it for
Okay, I
years.
have a picture of that on the historical page.
Yeah,
Okay.
Clark Pullen was a teacher here, and Charlie was his, Charlie Pullen was the guy who was on the creamery.
Okay.
I think he was his dad, but, yeah, Charlie Pullen ran the
Now,
creamery.
see, this is what we like about the storytelling. We learn stuff.
Yeah.
We do.
Yeah.
You get a bunch of brains together and. Okay, carry on.
All right, we've established that the Blue Moon Theater was in second block. Second block of Main Street. Very good.
It's
Okay.
the empty building, isn't it? I mean, that empty space, that was the Blue Moon.
Part of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, part of it was, and then part of it is that.
Okay.
And then he built a new one over where the junk store was, there in the corner.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna try to wrap this thing up. No, it's okay.
Just got here.
Dad went out on his own finally after a few years of working with Merle. 2 years after he went out on his own, a bouncing baby boy showed up. That'd be me. Mom said that I cried for 3 years.
Still crying.
I'm not. Well, I whine now. I don't cry. Not sure about that one. Mom and Dad lived in a little house behind Jared and Stephanie's house, which he's going to talk about here in a few minutes. That thing is torn down now, which I'm grateful for. It was an eyesore. We live next door to Mother's parents, Perry and Lilibel Berkeley. Granddad Berkeley owned and built on to the shack to where it is right now. This was a place where the kids have eaten for many years. I wonder how many years that thing's been serving lunches to kids at Lindsay schools. Mimi Thomas worked there at the shack with her mother, flipping burgers and making Frito chili pies for the kids to eat. I understand you can't get that kind of food there anymore. It was great. As a kid, young kid, I got to meet all the older kids because Mother's brother, Wendell, was a star on the state championship, which Hody talked about those state championship teams. Well, Wendell was the right guard on that 55-56 team, along with a couple of the Estes brothers. I know Hunk was one of the members of that team. They won the first 4 state championships for Lindsay during that time. Not sure what year, but Dad went into business for himself, and he retired after about 25 years. He worked in a building adjacent to John Lynch's tin shop, which is now the welding shop, neighbor's welding shop. We worked in that little 25-foot building for many, many years.
Not very many.
Well, then they built the building over on 2nd Street, Southeast 2nd Street, and Dad built that basically by himself. I don't know how he did it, but he basically built that thing by himself. Mom and Dad were, and I are members of, charter members of Calvary Baptist Church. There was a little issue between First Baptist and this group of band of brothers and sisters, and they left the church and formed Calvary in '55. That same year, Mike showed up on the scene. She didn't say that you cried for 3 years, but
He was probably good.
he probably was. He's probably a lot better than I was. So that's one of the reasons that we're so proud to be members of Calvary, because of that legacy of starting that church. Now back to the shop. Dad worked all of his life, and he expected me to do the same. At the age of about 10, he started me working in the shop, cleaning the floors, sweeping here and sweeping there. Later, had me sanding on cars and trucks. You'll recall what I wrote about Papa and the Thomas family working to make a family income. Well, Dad was not like his dad. I remember after I had finished sanding an oil field truck, I asked Dad, Mom may remember this, may not, I asked Dad, how much am I going to get paid? And Dad said, well, how much are you worth? Well, that's a difficult answer for a 10 or 11-year-old kid. How much am I worth? Probably not a whole lot, but he asked me how much, and I came up with an idea of $12. So he gave me $12 cash out of his wallet. I went straight down to Main Street to Ben Franklin, and I bought a snorkel, a mask, and fins, and went straight to the swimming pool. And I used those things. I love those things. I had more fun with that mask and snorkel and fins than anything I ever owned, I think. Lots of fun. I love swimming as a kid. So, see, I never knew what Dad had done for me, changing the culture for me. I just have recently, not too many years ago, read a book about Ben Franklin. And that book told a little story about me. Did I say Ben Franklin? Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. Abraham Lincoln. That's one of the things I quit teaching. I can't remember stuff anymore. But it's about Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln essentially, for the first 21 years of his life, was an indentured servant to his father. Every dime he made, whether he was in the house or not, went back to his dad for the edification and the feeding of the family. And until he reached 21, he couldn't keep any of the money. He even worked on the Mississippi River, hauling in a barge, towing and poling a barge up and down the Mississippi River, and every penny that he made went back to his family. But Dad didn't do that. Dad paid me for my work. And that was a cultural change for him because he wasn't afforded that courtesy. And I never really knew what Dad did for me until a long time ago, until I read that book. Well, 1957, Mom and Dad borrowed $6,000 and built the house on 4th Street, which was the neatest thing that we ever had as far as the family is concerned. Mike and I had bedrooms of our own, and it had a big living area and a big kitchen, and it was just wonderful. Just part of the endearing legacy of the Thomas family. Mom and Dad were great to Mike and I. They were good parents. Hauled us all over the country on vacations. We got to see Yellowstone and Yosemite, all over the western part of the United States for year after year. And in fact, one story that I find is absolutely unbelievable is they vacationed with some people that lived here in Lindsay in the mid-50s. He was Vernon and Margie Miller. They were transferred in here with Superior Oil Company, and Whistle was a roughneck, and they vacationed with Margie and Whistle got transferred to Farmington, New Mexico in '57, and Mother and Dad vacationed with them every summer for 40 plus years. They went to Yellowstone together, Canada. They just went all over the place together, and we've got my head's so full of memories of those vacations that I'm just about to bust. But that's pretty much. I've left out a whole bunch of the other junk that's really not all that important. But I want to turn it over to Jared. He's going to talk about his relationship with the bank and the Griffiths and the Finches, I guess, a little bit to a certain degree.
A little bit. I was waiting for you to tell me what I was going to talk about because I didn't know. So as a one of the 4 generations of the Thomases that are in here today, we have been tied to Lindsay for a long time. My wife Stephanie didn't have much of a choice. I sort of kind of just drug her back. And so we're fortunate. I'm excited that my kids get to go to the same school that I went to, that they get to grow up in the same town and be a part of the legacy of Lindsay. Although it may be different today than what it was during the times that the Dad spoke about, but it's of humble beginnings, and it's of putting in hard work and to build something for your own family. So in 2015, my wife and I, we'd moved back and bought a house on Creek Street, which was the second house on Creek Street that I had lived on. Also working on Creek Street. I might as well call everything Creek Street at this point. So grew up on a house on Creek Street, and then we bought a house on Creek, and then she comes to me one day and says, hey, the Baker house is for sale, and I know you're going to kill me, but I'd like to have it. And so I was like, yeah, you're right. I may kill you. What are you talking about? So it was one of those things where God had kind of sort of planted seeds for this. We went on a caroling trip on a cold winter evening, went caroling, and Joanne came out on the front porch as we sang carols to her, and it stuck a moment in Stephanie's head at that moment, and she fell in love with that house. And then it came around to where we had the opportunity to buy it in 15, and then we were trying to sell the third house that we had, as we were in Blanchard at the time, and so we were trying to sell that house, and 3 houses in, it was I kind of just went over there and worked at night and kind of tearing this house to limb. It old lath and plaster house, and I mean structurally it was in great shape. It just needed to be updated. And so kind of through the evenings I would go through and tear out some of these lath and plaster walls and turn it into a 2-story gazebo there for a while. But we tried to resurrect it. You could almost hear the house breathe as of the weight that we'd kind of tried to take off of it. But Downey from the Historical Society gave a write-up that I guess really was written from Riso and Joanne's perspective, right? So I'll read this quickly to kind of get to current state. It is in Park Place edition. Park Place Investment Company of Lindsay, Indian Territory began on February 14th, 1905. On Valentine's 1905, there's another twist to this. I started at American Exchange Bank on Valentine's 2006. So 101 years later to the day that John Long, President, John H. Knox, Vice President, Theodore Wagner, Secretary Treasurer, were a part of this Park Place Investment Company. On December 5th, 1905, Park Place Investment Company was sold to the Lindsay Investment Corporation. And at that point in time, fast forward a little bit later, February 13th, 1907, the Lindsay Investment Corp sold lots 5 and 6, which is where our house sits in Block 28. The Park Place addition to Lucretia Bolliard in the amount of $250. So those 2 lots sold for $250. The investment corp donated and dedicated to the public forever all of the street alleys that are a part of the Park Place addition to the town of Lindsay, Garvin County, Oklahoma, lying east of the west line of Knox Street, including the said Knox Street as follows. Blocks 1, 2, 13, 14, 15, 16, 27, and 28 are all part of that addition. Once again, speaking from Joanne's perspective, our house at 710 West Creek Street was built by Chaz P. and Lucretia Bolliard, and they think that it was built somewhere around 1910, based on kind of deducing some information. That there was a large solid wood siding door that separated the entrance. So as we got in there and I started tearing kind of things out, you could see in the floor where it used to be separated rooms to the bottom floor, and they had patched in some woodwork, so you could tell where that house had kind of been patchwork over the year. Of course, in the time it was built, there was no centralized heat and air, so each room had its own heating room and where they could close walls off and heat individual rooms. There is a closet upstairs in the 4 dormers upstairs that has the flue that came up through downstairs. You can tell where they patched the flue and they took it out. Ava's room has a concrete flue that comes through the corner of her room, of which we just kind of wrapped with shiplap to kind of bring it out a little bit. So fun times as I was tearing through that house. Underneath the stairwell, there was the return air that had been put in at some point in time, probably during Joanne's time. And so I was tearing out a shelf, and as I teared out one of these shelves, I flipped it over and I read the word Baker on the bottom of the shelf. And so I just kind of set this shelf to the side and ripped out the next one, and it had writing on it too. And I set it off to the side and I was like, oh, well, Riso probably must have had some store or something that he had Baker on it. I didn't really think much about it, and as I laid it out, I realized that I had the sign backwards. It's a long sign. It's probably nearly 15 feet, 12 to 15 feet in length, and it's a Studebaker Wagons and Carriages sign that was cut in half, and then they notched the corner so you wouldn't knock your knee off going in here, and they flipped the sign upside down so it still is in perfect writing on the bottom side of this. And so we hung it in the house in a corner. And from my conversations with a little bit, down, you may have a little bit inside. Apparently there was a livery?
Livery stable.
A livery stable that was somewhere over by the library, maybe. I can't think of, I didn't even know that Studebaker made wagons and carriages until I saw this sign.
Underneath,
Oh,
in
our old
the
building.
cruises, the old cruises
Yeah.
building, that's where they used to make the wagons.
Okay.
It's a full
It used to be a
basement.
3-story building.
Yeah, it's a full basement, and they had doors. They made the wagons down underneath and brought them out the west side.
Okay.
Yeah. Cleveland.
The emblem on your General Motors cars is a carriage.
Yeah, Orville Cleveland.
Yeah.
Orville Cleveland is who told me that story, and he said, hey, did you know? I said, I didn't know there's a basement there. He said, let's go. So we went down in there, and it was so interesting because I wish he could tell. I wish he was here to tell. He said, well, over here, this is where they did this, and this is where they did that. And it was perfect how they brought the wooden stuff in, and as you went in this assembly line, when it was finished, it was right there at the door. And they just pulled it out. So neat, but yeah, under Holly's old.
So Henry Ford didn't invent that?
I'm not Henry
Okay.
Ford. Guess Studebaker did.
So that's kind of a skip over, but just to give lineage of that house, in June 21st of 1919, the Bolliards sold the house to James and Vera Crawford, and the Crawfords then sold to Wayne C. and Robert A. Tinch, both single men of April 1930. Carl Finch Sr. and Anna Finch bought the property in 1939, and at their death, the property went to their son Carl Finch Jr. and his wife, which the irony, we didn't know, to be honest with you, when we bought the house, that the same people that my grandfather Griffiths bought the bank off of, Carl Finch Jr., lived in the home that I was now buying in the bank that my grandfather bought off of. So just the similarities of overlapping, it was really kind of neat. Obviously, it kind of goes to the story about how what brought Mimi and Papa Griffith. So I grew up with two Mimi and Papas. Both sides were Mimi and Papa. So Mimi and Papa Griffith were drawn to Lindsay from Moore in 1957 to buy American Exchange Bank, but Carl didn't sell it to him until 1972. So 15 years. So it just shows, some persistence on Papa's part, that he would wait for 15 years for that transaction to actually take place. Probably most people would have given up. Fast forward to 2023, there's no wait. They're waiting that long for something to take place. So
Yeah, they came with the understanding that it would be sold in 5 years. So to have waited 15, but they did.
So I get to be now a third generation banker. So my grandfather ran the bank, and then a dad, along with my uncle Barry. When I first started at the bank, like I said, February 14th, 2006 was my first day. I worked, and there's not many people that get to say that, and maybe in a bank where I worked with my mom, my dad, my aunt, my uncle, and my grandmother. So the first, when I started on the board, I was on the board with just Mom, Dad, Barry, Mimi, and myself. So when we say family at American Exchange Bank, it's the definition of it. So fortunately we get to come to work, and I still got to work with Mom and Dad for many years as they're in quasi-retirement, whatever they call it at this point. We get to work every day, and so now I grew up. I remember those Christmas Eve mornings at the bank. Dad would work till noon, so he said, but they would never show up till about 3 because we couldn't open Christmas gifts until he got home on Christmas Eve, and it seemed like forever. And so we fast forward today, my kids, so Jonah here and Ava out there, get to kind of endure the same similarities as we go through life. So
Christmas Eve at the bank was always hectic, and we would shut down at noon and start balancing, and about 12:45 the phone would ring, and Bobby wouldn't even answer it. Bobby Hilliard wouldn't even answer it. She'd say, "Jared, Terry, that's your kids." And you'd go pick it up, and it was one of them going, "When are you coming home?"
Yeah.
God's been really good to us. We've grown the bank since Jewel bought the bank. We argue about the amount, but it was either $2 million in assets or $4 million in assets. And this past year, we've bumped $100 million this year.
So we got to continue to add during COVID as we were, so he decides to step down and give me the reins, and I get to go take the reins of the bank as we go through COVID and a pandemic, and
I knew when to get out.
It's a who's who of different things, and then we get our financial position that we're in now. So he tells the stories of the early '80s and Penn Square failing and the effect that the oil field had in Lindsay. But then fast forward, it was at 15, 16 when oil then bottomed out again, and then we fast forward again and we go through a COVID, and it's as scarce around here as far as oil field yards as maybe as fast as it's ever been. Just kind of a ghost town, but kind of coming back, and so that's a good thing. But during COVID, we were a little bit slower, and I had a nephew, so Brooks Tigert had just graduated. Was one of the unlucky COVID graduates who lost out on really the back half of their senior year. He was just kind of sitting around, probably sleeping until noon most days. And so Dad had the idea. He said, "Hey, why don't you have Brooks come in and work and answer the phones?" And so he came in and started just answering the phones. And the next thing you know, he's like, "Well, hey, I can get behind the teller line, and so he started working at the teller line, and then he started opening up a few new accounts, and then he got in the drive-through and really became a staple. I hear it really quite a bit day in and day out about how the attitude and just the friendly nature that Brooks had at the drive-through each and every day. But he's decided to go to college, and he actually has just applied at another bank recently down there. So maybe we'll carry on this banking tradition, or if somebody else decides somewhere down the road, we'll see. I probably had the same attitude as Jonah. At the time, that was not something that I would have ever predicted, that I would be in the bank, and I don't think he had the same thought. He skipped over part of that story about how he got to the bank, and it's a good story, but it's at the same point in time, the bank shows us all sorts of lessons, so it's been good. But yeah, there's all sorts of pictures up here, but back to the blend of Papa Griffith came from really humble beginnings as well in Apache
Farming.
and Mimi Griffith, on the other hand, she grew up as a banker. Her parents were bankers over at First National Bank of Fletcher. In fact,
You got to tell that part.
the Dilling.
You want me to tell that part, or you want to
Yeah,
tell that
yeah.
part? And I kind of came from humble beginnings. I did. We didn't have much money. We were just poor folk, and went off to college and got an education and married the love of my life, and been the greatest thing that ever happened to me. But there's a little negative to her side of the family. Her great granddad was C.W. Dilling, who owned the First National Bank of Fletcher. And Mr. Dilling had a really good personal friend over at Fletcher. He was one Frank James of the Frank and Jesse James clan. So there's a lot of speculation. In fact, it's in some books that Mr. Griffith might have had, or Mr. Dilling may have had some financial help in getting the First National Bank of Fletcher from the James gang. There's also a 320-acre tract of land out east of Fletcher that's full of potholes. People digging up, trying to find the buried booty from Frank and Jesse James. So that's the dark side of the Griffith deal. Everybody has a black sheep, right? So,
My
no.
grandmother was very good friends with Mrs. James. The Jameses were in my grandmother and grandfather's house many, many, many times. And when he finally went to Missouri and died, they still had land. So Mrs. James would come back to Fletcher checking on her land, and she would stay at my grandmother's house. So, and we have some pictures of Frank James, in a buggy and with a dog, but he and my grandfather were very close, and so was Mrs. James with my grandmother.
Yeah, Mr. Dilling was not your typical banker. He was a rancher. Of course, in the 20s, they rode horses to check on their cattle, like all cattlemen did. And he had a horse that, if you've ever ridden horses in the pasture, you know how horses will tend to rub you against a tree or something. Well, that happened to him riding fences, and he got a thorn buried in his leg, and it turned septic, and he ended up having 30.
This was prior to antibiotics or penicillin, so he had 30 operations on that leg trying to clear up that infection.
And it finally killed him.
It finally killed him.
So
So I
Mrs.
never knew him. He was early 50s when he died.
and Ms. Dilling ran the bank by herself for many, many years. So she comes from true banking stock over there.
Yeah, so we're an interesting blend of that side of banking that also led to Mimi Griffith was she was Mother of the Year in the state of Oklahoma in '94. Is that right?
I don't remember. I think 94.
And then, of course, my Uncle Barry, who's in the Oklahoma City Philharmonic and still is playing to this day at 79. To like what Dad was saying, who Mimi and Papa worked in a body shop and was as blue collar gets. To with Mike and my Uncle Mike, who's worked oil field and been and just so it's an interesting blend in our family between the Griffith and the Thomases. I carry the namesake of both. My name is Jared Griffith Thomas. I was given both of those sides. So biblically named, God is the piece that holds all of this together for all of us. Our foundation is built around Christ and what that means. And so my namesake is the second oldest man of the Bible at 962 years. And so we named a Jonah biblically, and he and I have the same initials. So it's just been an important piece of our family, and Lindsay is tied to the center of all of that. So just been fortunate.
Beyond that, we don't have anything else to say. I guess we'd take questions, but I don't know that we'd know an answer.
Yeah. That's it.
Didn't All-Star used to be a drugstore too?
Do what now?
Yes, it was
That was Rexall.
Rexall.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
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 True fountain.
Yeah. First time I ever met Mary was in the drugstore. For those of you old residents know who Mary was, well, you'll know what I'm saying.
Didn't the Riley run each one of those
Yep,
three?
yep.
There was 3 Riley boys.
Harold D. and Harold. Or Harold D. and Buell.
And they each had a drugstore on the corners
Yeah.
of Main and
Yeah.
Chickasaw.
Buell was our doctor around here for many years.
Yeah, our family physician, Dr. Sashavari, in Norman, we saw him this last week, and Ann's had a tooth problem, and he was asking her something about it, and he said, well, does Lindsay have a dentist? And she said, well, we had 3 till just not too awful long ago. He couldn't believe that Lindsay had 3 dentists in this size town. So, yeah.
Okay.
You're welcome to look at the pictures. There's a little bit of conflab of everything. This is Mama and Papa Thomas. Long lineage. This is Berkeley's, yeah. Go ahead.
The Thomases live next to the Berkeleys on 2nd Street, off of Main Street to the east. You know, the Berkeley.
On Apache, there was half a block between them. Mama,
You know, on Apache, you've got the corner house, I forget who lives.
that was Granddad Berkeley.
You've
Well,
got the 2-story.
the 2-story. That was Grandmother and Granddad Berkeley was in the
Berkeley. I
2-story.
knew that was the Berkeley place. Well, the Thomas, at one time, Thomases lived in a little house.
That little
next to
pad
the
house.
Berkeley.
Yeah, and it was about a half a block, maybe 3/4 of a block east of the 2-story on
It
Apache,
was that
on the
far.
south
I was
side.
thinking it was right next to it.
No.
My mother lived facing Main Street, and I thought she used to visit with Ms. Thomas, you know.
Well, she may have.
But I
uh,
don't remember.
Grandma Cochran, it's where we're connected.
Yeah.
Grandma Cochran lived a half a block east of Mama Thomas on the north side of Apache, and Mama Thomas lived on the south side of Apache, a half a block north, or back to the west. Isn't that right, Mom?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, I can just still really hear, you know, back then they had the trash cans in the alley.
Yep.
Not on Main Street.
Yeah.
And Mother would visit with, I was thinking she said Ms. Thomas, and I thought that had to be your pawpaw.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
But anyway, you're supposed to clear this up for us.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay.
That's it. That's all we've got. Thank you very much for having us. Sorry we bored you for so long.
Thank you for watching. Please join our YouTube channel to see our past and future programs. Also, please follow our Facebook pages, the Murray Lindsay Mansion, Pikes Peak School Museum, and the Lindsay Community Historical Society.